Thanks. We're going to have your Q&A later. Doctor, thanks very much for that fascinating talk with the illustration of devices that are currently in use. And that's the theme of this next session, of session 7, telemedical device in use, in development and in use today. And our first speaker will be Will Rosellini, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of Transponder Incorporated, a company with proprietary neuroprosthetic technology that enables patients to close the feedback loop controlled entirely by a patient's phone call, cell phone call. This system not only controls the input-output signals to and from the nervous system, but also can manipulate brain plasticity to incorporate information from the implanted neuroprosthetic. Will Rosellini.
Thank you very much. I don't think there's anything better than getting introduced by a Nobel Prize-winning astrobiologist at a conference held by the founder of Sirius Satellite Radio and a biotechnology pioneer, and then following Dr. Bruges here, who actually gave us a lot of ideas we presented after him last year at the LARDA conference. So I'd like to lower expectations after seeing his presentation. There's no way you can match him. And my sister, my younger sister, had 2 open heart surgeries. It's how I came to be down in Houston. And so the constant monitoring and effort by cardiologists like him, that's a family thing, and that's very important. However, the nervous system, whereas the heart is lovely and romantic, the nervous system is sexy. And what I'd like to start with, since we are oversubscribed for our Series A round, I've got about a 2-week window where I don't have to ask for money from venture capitalists. So I'd like to have a little fun with this presentation to talk about where I see the science going. Not specifically with microtransponder, we might get there, but with people like you. So one of the things we've been talking about has been the spatial, temporal advantages to telemedical bionanotechnology. So I'd like to start with a fairly conservative statement. The Vice President of the United States is a cyborg leading a military into war that has stated publicly that they would like 50% of their vehicles and men to be unmanned. So we are at a very interesting inflection point. I like the way that the conference started saying that robotics was a very difficult discipline. I agree, I'm not very good at math, and so the physics behind robotics is very complicated. But what we're looking at right here, Vice President Dick Cheney has a pacemaker. And a pacemaker consists of a battery, a wire, and electrode contact. And what you'll see in the theme of this particular presentation is those 3 components are going to start to change and change the way that we interact with machines and the way that machines interact with our bodies. So I'd like to start with this conservative statement and then move into some of the more science fiction aspects of what we're talking about. So the most successful neuroprosthetic or device that interfaces with the nervous system is the cochlear implant. So there are hundreds of thousands of children who were previously unable to hear that have gotten an implant that directly interfaces with the nervous system that allows an artificial machine part, like a microphone, to translate information into the nervous system where it can be interpreted and perceived by the brain. In addition to the cochlear implant, Medtronic has started to apply what we call pacemaker technology to the nervous system. So Medtronic is using a lot of pacemaker technology. In fact, it's not much different. You have a battery, a wire, and electrode contacts that are placed in the globus pallidus of the brain. Traditionally, the neurostimulation or neuroprosthetic industry has been dominated by engineers. They don't have a lot of respect for the nervous system, and they say, well, we're going to turn this on, and we're going to see what happens. And there's not a lot of thought, well, there is a lot of thought, but there's not a lot of exploration into why these things are happening the way that they are. So for a patient with tremor or Parkinson's, there's a lot of success associated with stimulating globus pallidus in the brain, achieving some sort of neurotransmitter response that in effect has clinically meaningful or relevant changes in the symptoms that the patient is having. Cyberonics is another company down in Houston that has had enormous success with what's called a neurocybernetic prosthesis. So the vagus nerve stimulator that Cyberonics is marketing right now for FDA purposes for the treatment of epilepsy operates on the principle of a very simple being able to turn a device on and off. One of the interesting things that's happening as these devices become more effective at interfacing with the body is we start to change our reliance on pharmaceuticals and their release over an unpredictable 8 to 10 hour period of time. We now have the ability to turn a device on or off. And so the spatial aspects of making the devices smaller and more integrated, more biocompatible, that's an interesting concept. And I think that the hardware is going to be developed to a point where it's almost a non-existent aspect of interfacing with the body. The more interesting question that I'd like to explore today is, to what extent is this temporal processing of the ability to turn devices on and off sort of enable our ability to be more intelligent about how we're interfacing with our own nervous system? So right now, the FDA has given approval for this device, and basically the device works very simply. It buzzes a patient with epilepsy in such a degree that an electrical current travels up through the nervous system into the brain and resets the brain. It has such an offshoot of neurotransmitter that the brain literally desynchronizes and resets, stopping the seizure. This happens every 5 minutes for 30 seconds while the patient has the device turned on. This has been a very successful device. This pacemaker technology has also been applied to the chronic pain market. So if you are refractory for pharmaceuticals, meaning you can't achieve relief with aspirin or gabapentin or even morphine, you are refractory for a pharmaceutical regimen. So what happens is a neurosurgeon will say, well, what we need to do for your low back pain, we need to splice open your spinal cord, we need to get into the epidural space and drop some electrodes in, run a wire out, and then turn this system on and off the way that you perceive pain actually being controlled in your body. So it's a very subjective perception for these patients. So there's a certain range of electricity that we can put into the body that patients generally feel as being acceptable. These can go up and down, but primarily the mechanism of action by which this electricity is controlling pain is not well understood. Some of the disadvantages, and I think you'll see with the CardioMEMS and the follow-on presentations for the rest of the afternoon, the electrode wire battery combination has a lot of disadvantages. So if you imagine you have a spinal cord stimulator implanted in your spinal cord with a wire that's coming out and then leading to a battery, there's a lot of fighting going on associated with patents that control the size of the battery, the power of the battery, the size and the relative placement of the electrodes and the wires and how that all interfaces. But ultimately, you've got a big problem. The problem is when you move from side to side, those electrodes shift because you have a big anchor that is keeping it stabilized against the electrode tissue interface. So this thing is falling off of the area where the patient perceives a pain relief if you apply electricity. So there are a number of disadvantages associated with a wired battery system that people are actively looking at today. In addition to that, the brain is a very interesting place in terms of what perception of pain actually means. To date, and this has changed in the last 2 to 3 months, the state of the art for controlling the ability to interface with the nervous system is an up and down button. Up meaning you get more electricity applied to a particular piece of tissue, down meaning that's too much and you perceive it as an unpleasant feeling. The question is, why do we perceive pain that way? Or why do we perceive electricity this way? And that's what we're starting to explore at Microtransponder. So ultimately, Microtransponder is making progress on the spatial front. So what we are developing is what the electrical engineers will call a passive LC circuit that uses standard lithography to carve out biocompatible coils and ASICs to enable wireless communication. Ultimately, if you're not an electrical engineer, think this is a toll tag system where you drive underneath the toll booth. It's powered up using the big coil in the toll booth, and you're able to generate electricity, or you're actually able to record signals in the same way utilizing this technology. It's very well understood technology. The ultimate advantage that we're talking about here is making this thing wireless, and we've placed it here just for fun on our biggest competitor's battery. the ability to take a device and make it implantable and injectable allows for different opportunities in terms of interfacing with the nervous system. So one of the things that I've been doing at the conference is saying, hey, we have a pretty smart device here. Ultimately, we're going to be dealing with a lot of the same problems associated with encapsulation, migration, et cetera, et cetera. This is more the spatial problem. And I don't want to go too far into that because I'm going to try and collaborate with a lot of people here and come up with some novel IP and have some real good ideas how to do that. But what I wanted to talk about was this temporal aspect of being able to control the devices. So what you're looking at here is a map of the real estate dedicated to listening and hearing different tones or pitches. So your cochlea is a peripheral data input place. So when you hear a sound wave, what's happening is that sound wave is being translated into a meaningful form into the cortex, and the cortex has allotted certain amounts of real estate for each particular type of tone. So this is what your and my cortex looks like related to these tones. If you are a soldier, or if you are OCD, or have a variety of psychological disorders, or maybe you're just getting older, a lot of people experience what's called chronic tinnitus. So if you go into a quiet room and you hear a buzzing noise, that's called tinnitus. This buzzing noise is, in most parts, germane. So I have a buzzing noise because I listen to my iPod too loud. It goes away because I don't worry about it. For a large variety of people, or a very big variety, this noise becomes an all-encompassing thought. And what we're seeing with sort of disease indications that have to do with perception, for example, a roadside bomb actually causes the physical sensation of a very loud tone. Well, now you're starting to think about that tone over and over and over again as a fear mechanism. And your brain is starting to put different chemicals out to explore, hey, why are we afraid of this tone? And now the neurotransmitter soup in your brain has started to change. And the brain has started to change in relation to this input system. So what you're looking at for a normal person, if you hear an explosion, you're probably going to be worried about different aspects of that sound. Or for a soldier, you'll be very worried about that particular aspect. And so now the sound, the tinnitus ringing in the ears, is also accompanied by stress and anxiety, or in the neurotransmitting form, acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is the pay attention drug. And when acetylcholine is present in the brain, you have a lot bigger tendency to be able to pay attention. One of the phenomenons that we've seen in the last 5 years is the attempt to give Ritalin or Adderall to our children in order to increase norepinephrine, acetylcholine, and some of these neurotransmitters in the brain to increase their attention. Unfortunately, that attention is spread out over an 8 to 10 hour period. In that 10-hour period, you're getting all kinds of data that you don't need to pay attention to. And so what we're trying to do with the device is be able to control the ability to turn that neurotransmitter on and off as it relates in time. Not just a drug that you take and hope that you get some good information for 8 to 10 hours. You're actually pairing the information with the drug. So our scientists have already shown that if you stimulate nucleus basalis, and cortex, if you're stimulating in the brain, you can achieve this sort of acetylcholine release at the same time that you're getting a piece of data that's of interest to you. And you can actually increase and enhance memory based on that particular phenomenon. Well, we don't think that brain implants are a particularly marketable idea. We're trying to reproduce that effect, and we've had a lot of success reproducing that effect with vagus nerve stimulation. So using a different stimulus parameter, a different method of running the device, so the vagus nerve implant, we are hoping to show that we will be able to change the real estate in the brain such that different real estate is dedicated to different data. So what you're looking at here is an abnormal map. So now this is a person who is experiencing a chronic ringing state. And they might not have anything that's causing that ringing. So they could go into their doctor, and their doctor's going to call them crazy. You're not hearing anything. You have earmuffs on. It's impossible. But what's happened is the brain has reallocated a whole bunch of real estate based on this constant cycle of increased acetylcholine because I'm worried, and hearing this tone, increased acetylcholine, and that feedback loop has now caused this particular map to expand. With temporal control of the vagus nerve and the ability to generate acetylcholine based on data that we would want, we can try to remap the real estate associated with the cortex. So we apply vagus nerve stimulation when you hear tone 1. Apply it when you hear tone 2. Apply it when you hear tone 1. Over and over again, and we're pairing the vagus nerve stimulation with a tone, such that this tone is now starting to be able to remap the cortex. And we have a lot of good data showing this with deep brain stimulation or nucleus basalis stimulation. We should, by the end of the summer, have good animal data showing vagus nerve stimulation. And we're confident of this because one of our competitors beat us to it. So it will be coming out shortly. Ultimately, we think that this neuroplasticity concept is a very interesting idea in terms of temporal control for other devices, most especially our device, though. For example, in stroke or chronic pain, what you're looking at is the somatosensory cortex. So now we're just in a different part of the brain. The brain operates the same way. We've given a certain amount of real estate dedicated to feeling these sensations and causing a perception of something. So right here you have a relative map in the brain of the thumb, index, middle ring, and little finger. It's relatively uniform in its ability to sort of carve out this real estate. Well, if you have an amputation, what happens is the brain is plastic enough to start to utilize this cortex real estate to expand, to give you more control over those two inputs. It's a very important concept that's not necessarily invented by microtransponder, but we're hoping to manipulate in a less invasive way with our device. Now, ultimately, the ability to control remapping in relation to a digit, that sounds like an algorithm. That sounds like a piece of software. And we'll come back to that as to why the software and the temporal control of devices run hand in hand. Ultimately, what you're looking at here is the brain has different segments dedicated to the perception of inputs. And so you're seeing abnormally large hands, abnormally large lips, because right now, it's not very important that you're getting the data from your butt, that everything's okay. Generally, everything's okay unless you get an extreme pain example in that area. Now you're all noticing it. Guess what happened in your brain when I brought it up? You got an increase in acetylcholine. I have your attention now. What if I could manipulate that without you knowing? With it wirelessly. And that's what a lot of people are looking at. So ultimately, when we go back to the microtransponder concept, we think there's a lot of smart people working on the implantable devices. We think that bootstrapping this RF MEMS and basically toll booth technology with a whole host of nanoscale physics and plasma physics associated with different surfaces and making the spatial dimensions change in a way that is interesting in terms of interfacing with the body. Bioscaffolding, hydrogels, adding proteins to those particular devices to change the electrical conductivity of them. That's something that very smart people will take care of. Ultimately, though, we're very interested in what's happening here at the PDA level. The PDA is something that you could walk around with and be able to control your implants in a variety of different ways. You've seen the diagnostic tools that CardioMEMS has available to it based on just a deluge of patient data. It changes the way that people are interacting with their particular physician. What if the patients had control over their nervous system in particular environments? So one of our PIs is working on developing a software program that automatically changes your cochlear implant algorithm based on what kind of environment you're in. So you walk into a noisy restaurant or you're going to a baseball game. The PDA is tuning your hardware in a way that's real time. It's changing your perception of the environment based on a software program. And this software is starting to change the way that we'll interface with our own nervous system. In my mind, this will be an irrelevant concept in 30 years. The interface will become irrelevant. The only thing that will matter is the software. Ultimately, software has a number of different economic indicators. So as an economist, I'm always interested in seeing where the money is going in terms of development. So two of the things that you'll look at, half of all financial transactions in the world were done with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has a lot of different forms, and one of the things that artificial intelligence could do very easily is jump onto a PDA. And utilizing a lot of these concepts associated with, hey, the brain coordinates nervous system inputs this way. We could probably mimic that. And IBM is doing that. They've simulated 10,000 neocortex cells in rats, and they're making progress. And so now the hardware and the software are starting to leak over into how we're viewing the brain, and vice versa. We're building hardware and software based on how the brain does it. One of the very interesting things that I heard some of the Google guys talking about last summer, they view their current progress as 5% finished. So the search function is 5% of what Google is trying to do. So now we're talking about teraflop level computing coordinated with potentially super fast satellites with quantum and supercomputer processing information, all of which is done outside of the body. Now we're talking about completely different ways that we're able to go through the world based on not replacing the brain, but enhancing it. So one of the interesting things that the Google guys said, we not only want to be able to put information and search to acquire back to the brain, we want to go the other way and start to be able to search the brain. Sounds crazy. The data is starting to show that, hey, we've got some possibilities to move in that other direction. So I wanted to show you a couple of different examples of sort of the visualization of how the temporal control changes what the devices actually do. And if you'll cue those movies up, if we could do the epilepsy movie first, that'd be great. I always like it when we can actually do a simple technology before we can do a difficult one. So what you're actually looking at is a tinnitus model. So this person is hearing some sound here, and it's being mapped into the brain, so like we talked about earlier. If you implant the microtransponders along the vagus nerve there, we're going to try and remap this person's cortex. And so by pairing and stimulating the vagus nerve with this sound, we're actually changing the map of the cortex. And that perception of that chronic ringing goes away. So the second one is sort of a description of how epilepsy might work as well. This is the tinnitus one again. So if you could load the epilepsy one. So the important thing to sort of conclude, this is an epilepsy model. So really, this is already being done with a wired device. We're showing desynchronization here. And epilepsy, a lot of people are refractory for the drugs that are out there to deal with epilepsy. So it's already a $100 million a year business in terms of vagus nerve stimulation. We're trying to make it wireless. So our frontline indications are just spatial improvements in terms of making them wireless and making them smaller, making them injectable. But the big jump in neuroprosthetics over the next 10 years is going to be improvements with how the hardware is able to utilize algorithms and software with the nervous system. So I'm very excited about this particular field, and I hope to collaborate with a number of you on both sides. So thank you.